Hello all, and welcome to another installment of the Grand Campaign series. First, let me say thank you all for your continued support and enthusiasm for these videos. I am always excited to bring the best of my work to you. Now, the Mongols have arrived in the east, and in the west the terrible plague burned itself out, in which soap played a significant role. This brings me to today's sponsor, Stone Clean Soap, which I have partnered with to produce a unique bar of soap that bears a familiar kind of character, a scent that invokes a certain indomitable people who hail from the Iberian coast. I present to you Avarignian Sea Breeze. This luxurious, handmade soap is one of a kind, and made specifically for the channel. The smell of fresh Valencia oranges fills the air with a rich sweetness, while the slightest hint of sea salt gives it a kind of freshness and complexity. The bright citrus conjures sense of coastal prosperity, a summer festival, a tender memory shared beneath the leaves of an orange tree, while the salt brings to mind the sea spray, and the crisp, clean, salty air that is so characteristic of that region, air that would smell like home to a victorious soldier of Avarignia. Use this bar in good health, as you remember the tale of a people who were tossed about by the waves of history and yet navigated its crests and peaks to ultimate victory. Expertly crafted and stamped with the mark of the Avarignian people, it is carefully made from organic, artisanal materials from around the world that are sure to impress, made using the traditional, high-quality batch kettle process. Each bar is handcrafted and tested to the highest standard of quality, all while retaining the charm and detail of a lovingly made work of art. You can buy this soap for yourself and make a piece of the channel your very own right now at stonecleansoap.com for the price of $8.50. And there is a direct link in the description below. So, while supplies last, get your hands on this amazing piece of Season 4 memorabilia today. And if things go well, there may very well be more channel partnership scents to come. Now, on to the video. The Mongol Empire. Horse lords of the East, much in the same fashion as Royal Scythia commanded the steppe. However, their terrible leader, Mandukai Khan, commanded an advance that none in the West had yet witnessed. Black powder. When Mandukai came charging out of the wild steppe to China's north, he washed over the divided, squabbling warlords and overcame them, far too mobile and resilient for their fattened, settled people. This campaign was much faster than it had any right to be, and indeed was the fault of the disunited Chinese state of affairs more than anything else. However, as Mandukai conquered first the north and then attempted the south, he encountered the explosive power of the fireworks the imperial people used in an attempt to scare off his men, and especially his horses. This worked for a time, until the Mongol hordes learned to treat them as merely light and sound. Indeed, as they ground dozens of cities beneath their heels, they met fierce resistance in the south, which had constructed great and terrible walls which were beyond even their capacity to breach, and the conquest seemed to come to a halt with northern China. As the Mongols consolidated their gains, they came into contact with whinging alchemists and scheming scholars, every single one of them, down to the last man, desperate to save his own skin. And so, they relinquished their knowledge to the great Khan. One particularly crafty alchemist, a Taoist priest called Wan Fa, offered the Khan, in his own words, the very world itself. What better gift to a warrior than a weapon beyond compare? Wan Fa wheeled in this great steel barrel, affixed on wheels like a wagon, and had his attendants heave in a great iron ball. He also had his attendants bring an ox before the contraption. Out in the courtyard, to the horror of all present, save for the Great Khan, Wan Fa lit the fuse, covered his ears, and, in an instant, with a sound like thunder, the cow was blasted to pieces, and even the gates to the recently conquered royal palace were reduced to splinters, leaving nothing but scraps swinging idly from their hinges, and steaming gore coating the courtyard. Wan Fa suddenly became a very important man as the chief alchemist of Khan Mandukai, and was tasked with producing as many of these cannons as possible. As such, his conquests, which were already great, became legendary. Indeed, he was already the master of Asia by the time his army crested over the eastern horizon, seeking further glory. It was rumored that he did indeed overcome southern China, and now his dominion reached from Siberia to a place called the Dainam in the South China Sea, and even conquered a mysterious, snowy island where the sun rises, that a far-off people called the island of Ezo. Regardless of all this, he now came knocking down Europe's door, at the helm of 120,000 men. This was, quite immediately, Scythia's problem. The reigning Barosarvan at the time, Barosarvan Namdar Agarid, realized the state of things and ordered a final conquest east to take the last of the Central Asian tribes that persisted beyond the frontier. And so, as the Mongols lazily steamrolled tribe after tribe, Scythia panicked and tore through them like an arrow through the heart of an elk. Indeed, by 1240, the two already came to share a border, and there were no other options that foretold peace. Mandukai, the Great Khan, sent a letter to Barosarvan Namdar, demanding his capitulation. It read, "Westerner, it is clear you are a man of the saddle as well as I. I command you on your conquests of the savage lands laid out before you. Still, let not this land make your heart swell. It is not enough to stop me. I ground to dust a city more populous than your whole realm, that you have neither seen nor even heard of. Armor rusts at the sight of my army, and bears turn tail and flee. You can keep your crown and your wives and your horses, and above all, your people, so long as you submit. How many lives is your pride really worth? I once skewered 3 sparrows mid-flight, and in this way, I shall skewer your kingdom if you do not kneel." The Khan waited some time for a reply, but eventually it did indeed come, held in a long, decorated lacquer scroll box. When the Great Khan tilted its cover aside, however, there was no reply, no letter therein. All he saw was an arrow, with 4 sparrows skewered upon it. And so, in 1241, war began. Without mincing words, the first decade of this war was an unmitigated disaster, as the Mongols conquered all the way up to the Aral Sea, winning victory after victory against the Scythians. Indeed, they countered the Scythians so well because the Mongols knew themselves. They had fought a number of wars against each other when there were still quarreling clans, and so understood their own weaknesses, and, by extension, those of the Scythians. They knew to avoid direct confrontation as much as possible, and to focus on sieges, putting pressure on their settled urban areas in ways they were ill adapted to, especially with the advent of the cannon, essentially neutralizing city walls as a defensive asset. Some examples of battles during this early period included the Wutanjili massacre, which was the first direct battle between the two. Here, Scythian forces, utilizing their heavy mounted men, drove the Mongols into a narrow, tight mountain pass, neutralizing both of their mounted advantages, then dismounted and slaughtered them on foot. It was a harsh lesson for the Great Khan to learn, but for him, it was no matter. In fact, after that battle, he came to call the Scythians his Sagan Ulyud, meaning his white cousins. He played to his strengths at the Battle of Bet-Pakdala and the Siege of Yangakan. The Battle of Bet-Pakdala consisted of an overconfident Scythian army, having tracked down a Mongol army, rushing in right then without any thinking or consideration. But the Mongol army eschewed a direct engagement, instead leading them on wild chases, eventually dividing them and closing in on each subdivision in a kind of kill pit, of which there were 4 even quarters in this instance. The Siege of Yangakent saw the Scythians throw a lot of bodies at its defense, to the point where it was bristling with archers and ringed by heavy cavalry 3 times over. However, when the Mongols arrived, with their terrible cannons, they fired upon Yangakent from a mighty distance, bombarding it further than any archer could manage. This led the cavalry to sally forth away from the city, only to be softened up by cannon fire and soon surrounded by hidden flanking contingents. The city then fell in short order, its walls reduced to gravel. However, the tide began to turn by 1255, when the urban subjects of the Scythians had managed to reverse engineer the cannon, especially for use in mounting atop walls. Scythia even innovated in other ways, as it found new kinds of things to load into the cannons, one of which was the innovation of a special kind of shot that opened up into a scattering of meteor hammers, which is to say, ropes with weights at each end designed to wrap around the legs of men and horses alike, immobilizing and possibly even breaking them. This, when combined with new combat doctrines learned through observation of the Mongols, led to the war reaching a relative stalemate. Indeed, the Scytho-Mongol border would smolder with war in on and off wars for centuries to come, and the 2 mounted civilizations found themselves totally unable to best one another. As such, in between periods of wearing down Scythia, the Great Khan turned his sights south, and conquered much of Central Asia. By 1300, the map of the region looked more like this. The entire region was soaked in blood, and even the mightiest empire in the region was only barely able to withstand their might. Indeed, it took everything Scythia had to maintain whatever was left of the realm, and even that wasn't quite enough. Taganrog became an old city, as it began to rot to ruins, void of upkeep or maintenance or even the trade that once made it glitter so seductively in the plains. Indeed, the entirety of Scythian society was now geared towards war, because this war was one of survival. On the other side lay either victory or total destruction. Every nail, every hafting feather, every head of grain, and every pound of flesh, all given up to the crown, so it could work the ways of war. Even after the death of the great Khan Mandukai, who had established the largest empire history had ever known, his son, Mandukalu, carried on the torch. This war, it seemed, was truly eternal. Meanwhile, to the west, completely insulated from the Mongol threat by Royal Scythia, which played the unwilling and thankless role of Europe's guardian, the Analipsi continued to bring European culture, technology, and civilization to ever greater heights. Some notable achievements of the 13th century included the invention of the compound microscope, the flush toilet, bottled beer, the telescope, the barometer, the mechanical clock, the pocket watch, and even a primitive method of blood transfusion, the printing press, and the first steam-powered machine, a simple pump that ran on coal and used steam pressure to turn a mechanism that was meant to pump water out of wells. Furthermore, various intellectual developments followed suit, including the advent of calculus and improved knowledge of the human body by way of the very first detailed medical dissections, this last of which was still totally forbidden by the Church all the way through to 1300, which is why this field was essentially the sole purview of Pieria. There was little war during this period for Europe, though Anglia did complete its conquest of Britannia, as well as expanded its territory and influence in Swabia. Speaking of which, Anglia also saw increased Christian influence, especially in its continental holdings. Initially, there were persecutions, but under King Diorwulf Wicpersunu, he declared an Edict of Toleration, declaring that the most important core of Anglia is the right of blood, and that he wouldn't spill his kinsman's blood over wood, paper, and cloth. As such, an uneasy peace remained, though the church having loyalties to the Bishop of Rhodes never did sit well with the crown. Then, to the south in Santonia, a group of scholars hailing from the University of Thwar produced a map of the known world of such unrivaled quality and according to such precise cartographic standards that the institution of the Rathnakudan was put to shame. This map was dubbed the Sinolikos, roughly translating to total from the Greek. This tome heralded a new age, and while none yet knew it, served as the definitive marker between the old world and the new one. In the coming years, Europe held its breath as the scholars of Thwar, in partnership with Vasconian explorers, promised to append an encyclopedia in less than 5 years' time, complete with a riveting account of the great Khan of the mysterious Orient and the features of his royal court. For now, people marveled at what they already had the pleasure to see, all while they were totally incubated from the terrible Eastern threat, protected, on the occasion of coincidence, by the thankless Scythians, a nation of such historic tenacity that they spilled the blood of generations to resist the Mongol tide, a tide that had already washed away entire civilizations, lost in a sea of countless conquered souls.